Business Insider created a very informative video on the history of the drug war in the United States. Let's take a look at that.
Early as the 1800s, there were no federal restrictions on the sale or possession of cannabis in the U.S. Hemp fiber from the plant was used to make clothes, paper, and rope. Sometimes it was used medicinally, but as a recreational drug, it wasn't that widespread. A New York Times article from 1876 even cites the positive use of cannabis to cure a patient's dropsy, basically swelling from an accumulation of fluid. In the early 1900s, an influx of Mexican immigrants came to the U.S., fleeing political unrest in their home country. With them, they brought the practice of smoking cannabis recreationally, and it took off. The Spanish word for the plant started to be used more often too. Marijuana, or as it was spelled at that time, marijuana with an H. This is when the more sensational headlines about the drug began to appear. In 1936, a propaganda film called Reefer Madness was released. In the movie, teenagers smoke weed for the first time, and this leads to a series of horrific events involving hallucination, attempted rape, and murder. Much of the media portrayed it as a gateway drug.
Marijuana, a powerful excitant, produces unpredictable emotional results. But its greatest danger lies in the fact that it is a stepping stone to the harder drugs, such as morphine and heroin.
The following year, in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. Cannabis sales were now taxed. Part of the reason this act was passed was because of all the fear-mongering going on at the time. And a huge instigator of that fear-mongering was the man behind the Marijuana Tax Act, Harry Anslinger. Anslinger was named the Commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics during the Prohibition era. But once national prohibition ended in 1933, Anslinger turned his focus to marijuana. This is when racism and xenophobia really kicked in. Harry Anslinger took the scientifically unsupported idea of marijuana as a violence-inducing drug, connected it to Black and Hispanic people, and created a perfect package of terror to sell to the American media and public. By emphasizing the Spanish word marijuana instead of cannabis, he created a strong association between the drug and the newly arrived Mexican immigrants who helped popularize it in the States. He also created a narrative around the idea that cannabis made Black people forget their place in society. He pushed the idea that jazz was evil music created by people under the influence of marijuana. But these racist ideas didn't just influence the media's portrayal or the public's perception of the drug. The discrimination they encouraged was evident in real numbers. In the first full year after the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, Black people were about 3 times more likely to be arrested for violating narcotic drug laws than whites, and Mexicans were nearly 9 times more likely to be arrested for the same charge. By 1952, the Boggs Act was passed. This made sentencing for drug convictions mandatory. A first offense for possession could land you 2 to 5 years in prison and a fine up to $2,000. Through the 1960s and 70s, weed smoking took on a new perception through the counterculture movement. Young white people resisted mainstream culture and powerful institutions. This was the era of hippies, beatniks, and flower power. But despite all the peace and love, laws continued to emphasize the severity of the drug. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970, passed under President Nixon,
public enemy number one,
repealed the Marijuana Tax Act and instead made cannabis a Schedule I drug, the most serious class. Schedule I drugs are considered to have a high potential for abuse and addiction with no medical use. Other examples of Schedule I drugs are heroin, LSD, and ecstasy. Classifying cannabis as a Schedule I drug has been highly debated since then.
And marijuana is not a Schedule I any more than a hedgehog is an apex predator.
But to this day, it remains in that category, and criminalization still disproportionately affects minority groups in the U.S. The ACLU reported that in 2010, Black people were 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than white people, even though both groups consume marijuana at about the same rate. Some states have taken action to reduce this type of criminalization. 9 states and Washington, D.C. have legalized the recreational use of cannabis. and 29 states allow some form of medical marijuana. San Francisco recently dropped thousands of marijuana-related convictions, and Seattle plans to do the same. But this doesn't change the federal restrictions, and Attorney General Jeff Sessions seems hell-bent on enforcing those federal rules.
Good people don't smoke marijuana.
Kansas State Representative Stephen Alford made a case against legalizing cannabis by referring to the racist rhetoric of the Anslinger era.
What you really need to do is go back in the 30s, the African Americans, they were basically users, and they basically responded the worst of all those drugs just because their character makeup, their genetics.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, credit to Business Insider for making that long and informative video there. Yeah, I remember that story. That wasn't that long ago, January 6th. And the guy was like, yeah, the genetics of the black man makes this, they can't handle drugs, they can't handle marijuana. Nonsense, totally made up, total bullshit. This is reefer madness propaganda that took root, and many people still believe to this day. So you saw the timeline there. 1936, Reefer Madness comes out. It's sheer propaganda talking about how, you know, marijuana is evil and it makes you a bad person and it makes you become a criminal. And then boom, 1937, you have the first real anti-marijuana law that passes, which is the Marijuana Tax Act. Now, isn't it amazing how gradual they had to move in the direction of total criminalization? So it started with, okay, here's a propaganda video. Then it became, now we're just going to tax marijuana. Then they said it was 1952 when they got the Boggs Act, which locked people up for weed. And then finally 1970 was when Richard Nixon, this douchebag, said, all right, we're going to treat drugs like they're the worst thing in the world and lock people up. And by the way, there was an admission from top officials in Nixon's cabinet where they said, no, the whole reason we did it was to crack down on the black population and crack down on what they called hippie whites, because they knew that those demographics would never support Richard Nixon and would never support that White House. So they said, well, let's just criminalize our enemies and lock them up. And that's what ended up happening. They criminalized their enemies and they locked them up. And the quotes are insane when you go back and read. Like, that was the whole point of it. They weren't actually keeping people safe. They didn't think they were keeping people safe. It was a dirty fucking trick to try to criminalize segments of the population that they knew would never back them. So, and you also learn there that the same people who did prohibition, banning of alcohol, were directly involved in crafting the drug war. The same people, 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act, that came right after Reefer Madness in 1936, and it was 1933 that they got rid of prohibition. So you see the timeline. You see it's people in the government like, all right, what can we crack down on now, and how can we take away people's freedom more now? That's what was going on. And then you also see the disproportionate arrest rate. And listen, man, that's the history of this. So there's another amazing fact I learned about opium. Apparently, opium was perfectly legal in the United States. Laudanum, I think they called it, something like that. It was illegal until you had Chinese immigrants building the railroad, and they had their opium dens. And what happened is there were fears that the young white girls would go into the opium dens and start having sex with the Chinese immigrants. So they made opium and opium dens illegal. So again, it's amazing how this all stemmed directly from xenophobia and bigotry. But that's what happened. It stemmed directly from xenophobia and bigotry. And then here we are today, so many years later, and you don't have the freedom to put in your body whatever you want to put in your body if you're not hurting anybody else. And think about how many lives have been ruined as a result of this. And they talk about the disproportionate arrest rate. Black people, white people use drugs at a similar rate. Black people get arrested for 4 times more often. It's the same for selling drugs, by the way. White people are more likely to sell drugs. Black people are more likely to get arrested for selling drugs. So, and even putting the racial angle aside, there are plenty of poor white people who had their lives ruined as a result of this. So it's time to end the drug war. By the way, we also wasted $1 trillion in the process. We lock up more people than any other country on earth. So it's time to end the drug war and have reasonable laws. You can legalize, tax, and regulate substances, and also empty the prisons of nonviolent drug offenders, and also send them a heartfelt apology, because you've ruined so many lives for people doing something that's not even close to wrong.